excuse the theme music. It looks like I've still got a little Halloween left in me, but it helps set the stage as we begin to unwrap the dead. Hello and welcome back to the Scarab Solutions Ancient Art Podcast. In this episode, as promised, we'll take a close look at one particularly exquisite artistic masterpiece from ancient Egypt, the mummy case of Paankhenamun at the Art Institute of Chicago. Let's check out the iconography and symbolism throughout its decoration and see how the ornamentation works together to express a unifying theme paramount in Egyptian funerary belief. Come now as we unwrap the case of the mysterious mummy. The first point I want to talk about is the importance of hieroglyphs in Egyptian art. Hieroglyphs play a very important role in Egyptian ornamentation and iconography. The way that the Egyptians depict the 3D world on a 2D surface, like in relief carving and wall painting, is deeply related to how 3D objects are represented in Egyptian hieroglyphs, both stylistically and symbolically. They're related stylistically in the shape of objects and figures on a 2D surface, and symbolically in the meaning that an object, figure, or some sort of emblem has. The meaning of the object and its function as it relates to the rest of the composition, and often also to the accompanying inscription. So funerary relief work and painting often complement the accompanying inscription. I know, this is getting complicated, so let's simplify this with an example. This is a wall fragment from the tomb of a fellow named Amenemhet. He's the big guy in the middle, and that's his wife Hemet standing beside him, holding the lotus flower to her nose and affectionately resting her hand on her husband's shoulder. To the right of them you see another small figure standing in among the goods for the funerary feast, holding a big bovine leg. That's their son, also named Amenemhet. Amenemhet was a very common name during the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. A number of kings had that name too. What's being depicted here is a classic funerary feast, a common scene in private funerary shrines stretching way back as far as the Old Kingdom. An offering table piled high with grave goods stands before Amenemhet. Enough food and drink to keep his ka, his spirit, well nourished in the hereafter. This type of funerary feast and offering scene really functions as the ritualistic culmination of the funerary procession and decorative relief work of a private mortuary shrine. The entire decorative scheme of the surrounding walls leads up to this point where the deceased celebrates his life with his family, enjoys the nourishments of his soul, and has an offering presented to the gods on his behalf. The inscription running along the perimeter of the scene is very important here. It's an offering formula, a common prayer encountered alongside representations of the funerary feast throughout the Old and Middle Kingdom, and surviving well beyond, even after Egyptian private funerary practice takes on a rather different appearance. The painted scene here is basically a representation of the prayer. It's called the Hatep Dinisu, and it goes something like this. Hatep dinisu cha te henket ka apid shes menket hatep jafau chet nebet wabet anchet necher yam yamachi yaser neb jedu necher aa neb abiju. Now what that says is an offering that the king gives consisting of 1,000 loaves of bread, 1,000 jugs of beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, and cloth, an offering of provisions and everything good and pure on which a god lives for the revered one Osiris, Lord of Jedu, great god, Lord of Abydos. And then if we look at the painting, we'll see that a lot of what we just encountered in the inscription is represented here on the offering table and scattered about the room. On top of the table we have these slices of bread, and on top of that there's that big leg of an ox. To the side there's some jugs of beer, a head of an ox, parts of geese inside there, various fowl. But those slices of bread on top of the table, those tall, thin, vertical slices, they're not exactly in the conventional format in which the Egyptians represented the slices of bread. If we look at another example here from the Art Institute of Chicago, another wall fragment from a person's tomb, this is actually from the Old Kingdom, centuries earlier, from the tomb of Thenti. So here we see on the offering table slices of bread. If you look at the base of the slices, they're flat, resting perfectly on top of the table. and then the slices nicely meet together to form good loaves. If we go back to the scene of Amenemet, we see that the slices are not flat on the base of the table. There's a roundness to the base of those slices there. They're not actually slices of bread, even though that's what they're meant to function as here. But what's actually being represented are hieroglyphs. This is actually the hieroglyphic character for the flowering reed. If we look at the inscription above, all the way to the left, we see an owl. Just in front of that owl, there's another flowering reed. If you look closely, that flowering reed in the hieroglyphic inscription is represented in the same way that the flowering reeds on the table are represented. So literally, we have hieroglyphs incorporated into the decorative relief work. The manner in which the flowering reeds and the bread and the beer and fowl are represented here in this scene is precisely the same way in which Egyptian scribes would represent them in their hieroglyphic form. What the flowering reed is meant to represent here and standing in place of sliced bread is really, you could say, all the fruits of the field. As the inscription says, everything good and pure that a god needs to survive. The whole produce section at the supermarket. So now we have an idea of how hieroglyphs smuggle their way into Egyptian funerary art and add further symbolic messages to the scenes being depicted. Hieroglyphs have the distinct advantage of being not only words and language, but also real-world objects that can nicely and cleverly be incorporated into the scene. You oftentimes hear someone speaking about reading a work of art. In Egyptian art, that phrase takes on a very literal meaning. So let's turn now, finally, to the mummy case of Paankhenamun. Let's examine the symbolism behind the rich ornamentation and see how it can all be read together as a composition expressing a unified theme in Egyptian funerary belief, namely the idea of birth, death, resurrection, and eternal life, which we already touched on last time with our discussion of Khepri, the Scarab Beetle. The mummy case is later than the two wall fragments that we just looked at. It actually comes from the Third Intermediate Period, a time of decentralized, fragmented government in Egypt after the collapse of the New Kingdom, that time of all the famous kings like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, King Tut, and Ramses the Great. The lack of a unified Upper and Lower Egypt, however, certainly didn't hamper the artistic achievements of the Egyptians at this time. This is truly one of the most beautiful mummy cases I've come across, with its brilliant colors and a wonderfully symmetrical and almost minimalist composition, well, inasmuch as one finds minimalism in ancient Egypt. What I mean is, the artist was not afraid to leave plenty of white space, which gives it a far less cluttered feeling than many other mummy cases. Prominently displayed on the chest, we see a falcon-headed version of the winged scarab beetle Khepri, the god of the rising sun, pushing the solar disk above his head out of the eastern horizon. This symbol of rebirth and resurrection, appropriately enough, is very prominent in Egyptian funerary art. Just beneath the scarab, we see a little circle sitting on a flat base. This is the Egyptian hieroglyph called Shen. It's actually a loop of rope tied in a knot and represents the concept of eternity. Specifically, eternity in a cyclic sense, like the sun rising in the morning and setting in the evening. And it does this day after day, forever and ever, like a pendulum of a clock swinging back and forth. It's very appropriate to be found here, right next to Khepri, since Khepri also embodies that very same idea, through the sun's rebirth in the morning, death in the evening, and rebirth again the next day. As a little side note, if you take the Shen symbol, the little loop of rope, and stretch the loop into an oval rather than a circle, you get the cartouche, the round emblem that contains the king's name.